Okay, I'm going to create another video here, and in this video I'm going to try to go from the ISS directly to the moon, and to try to do that in a way that's a bit more efficient than the way that might seem the straightforward approach. So I'm going to select the docketed ISS scenario from the Delta glider folder. That way, if anybody wanted to kind of follow along, they would have a scenario exactly the same as I'm using. And once this loads up, I kind of prefer either this view or that one. I don't really like the virtual cockpit very well. Now, anybody that's gone to the moon, while parked on Earth, you might take a look at this scenario and look around a little bit, maybe see the moon out there, and think that, okay, well, I'm just going to bring up a line plane, I'm going to target the moon, and well, it looks like all I got to do is undock, go to the descending node, bring my relative inclination down to 0, and then off to the moon I go. And you could certainly do that, but if you know anything about these plane changes, you know that a plane change is very it's very expensive. It's very energy intensive in the amount of fuel you'll burn to go from 72.55 relative inclination down to 0. You would consume about as much fuel, if possibly not more, than you would on a regular launch to orbit. So that probably isn't the best approach. Another idea, something that I would put out there, if you select Map MFD, and we'll bring up orbit plane here, and we'll target the moon. We can see here where the moon is at relative to our orbital path around the Earth. The green line, of course, is our orbit, and if we were to sit here, we'd be able to watch our Delta glider go around this green orbital path every 90 minutes or so. The moon, on the other hand, takes about 28 days to complete an orbital path. So if we sat here for 28 days, then the moon would go all the way up here, all the way around, and finally back to where it started. The best time to go to the moon directly from the ISS would be where we would arrive at the moon, and I kind of emphasized that point, that it would be our arrival time, not our departure time. But we would want to arrive at the moon when the moon would be either at this position, where it is exactly crossing over here, or when the moon would be at that position. Either one would be fine. And that, again, that would be where the moon would be when we would be arriving. And since it takes a little over 3 days to get to the moon from the Earth, that would mean that we would actually want the moon to be somewhere back here when we depart. That way, after a 3-day drift, then the moon will be at this point when we actually arrive there. So if we look at the date up here, which is a little hard to see because of the blue background, but if I rotate a little bit, it's easier to see it, is March 14th, a little after midnight. So the question becomes, what date and time will it be when the moon is here? and what date and time should we leave. You can kind of eyeball this, knowing that it takes 28 days for the moon to complete a cycle. Then you can kind of count these squares out. It's about 14 days from this point to this point. So that's 1 square, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 squares. So 14 divided by 7 is 2. So it's approximately 2 days per square. So that would be if we wanted the moon to be here when we arrive at the moon, and we need to rewind time, think about it that way, a little over 3 days, then that would be 1 whole square here would be 2 days, and part of this square would be, the other day that we need. So basically, when the moon is about right there, that would be a good time to depart. And if you want, you can get an exact figure for the date and time when the moon is here just by running the clock forward. And just to kind of follow the thought process, I'm going to go ahead and do that. So we can see the date is currently March 14th. So I want to know what the date is going to be and the time when the moon is exactly over that spot. So let me fast forward time here, and we're going to go all the way out to 10,000 to get through this quickly. 17, 18, 19, 20, 1, 2, 3, and we're getting pretty close. So let me come down to 100. Zoom in a little bit. We can see we still got a little ways to go. So let's take this out a little further. And we still got a ways to go. Move this over. Make sure I keep it in view. And it's not quite there yet. So let's keep it going. It's getting really close now. Let me zoom all the way in just to get a really good figure here. And let's just go with that. Okay, so we can see that at March, let me get the time where you can see it easier. March 23rd, and let's just call it 2200. That is when the moon is going to be in the position where we want to arrive at the moon. So we want to arrive at the moon on approximately, March 24th at 2200. So if we subtract about 4 days from that, that'll give us time to get to the moon and time to go through and set up the different things that we need to set up. So that would give us a time. 23 minus 4 is 19. So let's say on March 19th, and let's just call it 1800 or maybe even 1700. That way we've got plenty of time to set everything up. That's when we're going to begin doing everything that we need to do. Okay, does that make sense? So we're going to arrive at the moon on March 23rd at approximately 2200. So we're going to leave Earth. We're going to, undock from the ISS and get everything set up on March 19th at about 1700, 1800, around there. Okay, so the first thing that I would need to do then is to exit the scenario and go back in, since I moved the time forward. And again, you don't need to do that on every one, but just the first time you're trying to figure it out, it can help to move the time all the way forward to the point that you want to arrive at, and then kind of do the math in reverse. Otherwise, you can do the more crude method of just looking at map MFD and counting those squares. So now we're back here. We got the scenario restarted, March 14th, 1400, or rather almost midnight. And I'm going to go ahead and bring map MFD up one more time. Bring up the orbit plane, target the moon. And now we know approximately when we're going to depart, and that's not yet, so let's forward time to March 19th. Okay, we're coming up to the 18th, 19th, and we said we wanted it to be about 1700 or 1800. That way it would give us enough time to also set up our MFDs. And we'll go with that. So we're at March 19th, 1715. And again, we can see that our arrival time is here, and the moon is one full square plus a little bit of here and a little bit there. Okay, now we're going to start up. Now we're going to start up TransX. And I'm going to open it on both sides. And the first thing to look at, first of all, if you're not familiar with TransX, and there was, a time where obviously I wasn't, so let me kind of show something here because I think this is a little important maybe. The default view of TransX is kind of similar to Orbit MFD in that this default view that you have, this is the Earth that you're looking at. That's that gray circle. Similar to over here, that's that gray circle. And this is your orbit around the Earth. This is where you're at in the position of that orbit. Very similar to over here. In fact, I think you can actually sort of switch the view. If you switch it to this way, then you can see just exactly how similar these two views are, and even have some of the similar information between the two. So I just think it's important to understand what it is that you're looking at. So the first thing I'm going to do, over here I've got all this information, and it's set to select target planets, moons. That's what I want, but just to show you, if I click the ADJ, that'll adjust between ships and planets, moons. And I want it on planets, moons, that's fine. So now I'm going to click the plus, and that'll go between none, moon, and escape. And I want moon. So then the next thing I need to do is to click VW to bring up the maneuver view. And if I click VW, it'll go back and forth between setup and maneuver. In order to get to the moon, I need to perform a maneuver. So I'm going to click plus to turn maneuver mode on. And now I can cycle through the variables by clicking VAR, and this will just go in a circle. And I can go either direction. VR minus goes backwards, VAR goes forward. So minus goes backwards, VAR goes forward. And I want to go to the prograde velocity. And if you've hopefully gone to the moon the normal way, then you know that it takes about 3,100 and some odd change in prograde velocity to get out to the moon. Now I'm going to set the adjustment down to medium. And we'll go to a fine adjustment at this point. 3.15 is a pretty good starting point. And let me explain a little bit about what we're looking at. This is where the moon is currently at. This is the hypothetical orbit if we were to apply 3.15 worth of prograde velocity. This is the hypothetical orbit that we would have, and that would have us nowhere near the moon. So I need to adjust the date at this point. So I'm going to click on VAR, and when you adjust the date, course is if you need to adjust the date by days and days at a time, and we don't need to do that. We only want to adjust the date by a matter of seconds and hours. So I'm going to go all the way down to the ultra setting, and I'm going to click plus plus because we have to go forward with the date. And sometimes if you're trying to adjust heading, you can go forward or backward. But in this instance, the time is currently here, and we can't go backwards in time in orbiter. So I have to adjust the date forward. And I'm just going to go forward to this point, and I'm bringing this closest approach down as much as I can. And once it won't go any lower using the date, then I'm going to go back to prograde velocity and refine the amount of prograde velocity that I need to make a closest approach. And then we'll go back and forth between the date until we find exactly the right time to leave. So I adjusted, I went to a hyper setting, and now I'm backing up the date a little bit because I've already gone forward, so therefore I can, refine it. Okay, so that's as low as that's going to get. So now I'm going to go back to prograde and take away some prograde. And while I'm doing this adjustment, once you get to a certain point with the closest approach, it actually helps to come over to the other instance of transx and press forward, and then click view to view the encounter. And this will show me the minimum altitude to the moon. And the reason these are going to be different, I believe, is because of the way this measurement is done. I think it's basically like from the radius of the moon or something like that, and this would actually be a minimal orbital altitude. So this is actually what we want to look at when trying to figure out how close or how accurate our approach is. This gets us in the proverbial ballpark, but this refines the exactness of it. So let me back this off now. The prograde velocity, I'm just trying to get it more precise. Okay, so that is about as low as it's going to get right there. And now I'm going to go back to the date, and I'm going to see what happens if I wait one more orbit. So instead of leaving here in a few minutes or whatever, 20 or 30 minutes, however long away that is, I'm going to see what happens if I go around one more orbit. Okay, so we're almost back around. Okay, that was a fast improvement. So let me go to the hyper setting and just continue to make that adjustment till it won't go any lower. And let me go back to the prograde, and we'll go to hyper on that as well, or ultra. Let's go to ultra, and I'll see if I can refine this. See, that's making an improvement, and we're pretty close here already. 1,000 300 kilometers, pretty close. But I'd like to get it all the way down to at least 500 kilometers. Okay. I would say that is the best approach, or that is the best time right there. Because we're going to have to make a mid-course correction. So trying to get this at, what we normally would want to end up at would be like 30 kilometers when we finally get to the moon. But at this point, we don't need to be that accurate. We're trying to find the right date and time to leave, and the really close approximation of the amount of prograde velocity that we need. Now that I have that information, I can see here the date is 51/9/87/8042, and if I click view, that tells me that's 4,000 seconds away. Now that I have that information, what I need to do is basically disregard it, and I'll explain why. I'm currently attached to the ISS, and I'm not taking the ISS to the moon with me. That would be kind of cool, maybe, but I can't do it. At least I don't think I can. That might be something to try someday, actually. But I digress. Once I detach from the ISS, I now have a slightly different set of orbital parameters than I do right now. So that means that this solution that I came up with in TransX is going to be at least slightly inaccurate once I undock. But I still wanted to stay docked up to this point for a variety of reasons. One would be, if you're in the XR2 or XR5 as an example, then you would need to have external cooling excuse me, you would need to have external cooling turned on so that you wouldn't be wasting all of your liquid oxygen while fast forwarding time. The Delta glider doesn't have that limitation because it doesn't have all those extra fuel simulations. So now I'm going to undock, Control D, use a little bit of translation to back off, and maybe even a little bit of up or whatever, just to give myself some distance from the ISS. And now what I'm going to do, close the nose cone. Now I'm going to reset my maneuver and figure this all out again. But I already know that it's going to be almost exactly the same as this stuff. So I don't have a ton of work to redo. But since I'm now on a slightly different orbital path, it's important, it's more accurate that I go ahead and reset my maneuver and refigure this out. I don't have to. If I could go ahead with this burn, and if I did, the only thing that would be off when I finished my burn, instead of being, normally you would be off by, say, if this is 500 kilometers now, it might be 300 or 700 after I did the burn. If I burn with this current maneuver without making any adjustment, it would probably be 1,000 kilometers or 1.5. It would be off by that much, just for the fact that I'm on a different orbital path. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Maneuver, bring up the maneuver, turn it off. That basically resets everything. Now I'm going to turn it back on and go through the process one more time. And I know again that it's basically going to be exactly the same as it was in my ejection point is 4,000 seconds from now. So basically most of the work is already done. But at least now I've got it all figured out already. So let's go back and put in our prograde. And go over to the date, and currently the date is right now. And remember, we wanted to go around one orbit, so let's go to the ultra setting and go forward. Okay, and then again we'll just keep clicking plus till this won't go any lower. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the prograde. And back to the date. And back to the prograde. And there we are again. We're at basically where we were before, although this time I notice I'm on a completely different inclination. That's okay. So now I can go ahead and burn this maneuver when it's time. Or if I wanted to, I could play around with it a little bit more and maybe try to get the inclination the other direction. That would depend on whatever your preference is. The inclination here is going to have me on a coming out of the west and going toward the east, sort of a more normal orbit. A lot of times when you end up at the moon, you end up with an inclination closer to 180, which is a reverse orbit that's coming out of the east and heading west, which doesn't matter because the moon has no atmosphere. But I don't like to end up with an inclination of like 90 or 270 because those are polar orbits, and I just prefer not to have that. So if you wanted to, you've got time, you could kind of tinker around with this stuff, go back and forth between prograde and date until you've got things set how you like. Again, I'm just trying to see if I could get the inclination the other direction just out of curiosity. It doesn't matter. And since I know I'm going to be doing a mid-course correction, I'm not at this point going to worry about the base alignment. So now I would just click VW to bring up the target mode, and I'm 6,000 seconds away from the time to burn, so I can just accelerate time to get to that point. $800, $700, $600, $500, $400, $300, and go down to real time, go to prograde. I'm always paranoid about overshooting.
Rotation.
And burning. And warp time forward. Gotta be a little careful with this because that green X will start to drift during this burn. Okay, go back to real time. Line up the green X a little more. Just using control control translation at this point for smaller bursts. Once the delta V gets down under 100 or so, I start backing off the main engines, because that green X gets increasingly sensitive. And to finish up the last little bit there with translation. Okay, that's basically 0. So now if I click view a couple times to come back to maneuver view, go to VAR and turn off the maneuver mode, and you can see that the projected altitude is very close to what I started with. The hypothetical had me at 500 kilometers or thereabout, and now once you've done the burn and turn off maneuver, then this starts updating in real time. So it's now saying that now that I'm done with the burn, my new projected minimum altitude is 85 kilometers, and that's actually really good. Whereas if I were to leave that maneuver to the original maneuver where it was when I was docked to the ISS, I imagine this would be like 1,000 kilometers, or maybe even 2,000 or 3,000. It would be off by quite a bit due to the fact that that original maneuver that I set up only applied while I was docked at the ISS. Hopefully that all makes sense. So that's basically the end. I mean, if you know how to get to the moon, then you just go through your normal procedures at this point, fast forwarding till the mid-course corrections. The main thing I wanted to point out here was just making that off-plane transfer. So instead of doing a huge aligned plane burn and then going to the moon, we just simply waited to the right time to leave and then use TransX to help us get out there. So if I bring up orbit MFD at this point, I can shut off that target. And just for the sake of a little bit completion, we'll go forward to the point that would be the best time to do like a mid-course correction, approximately when this turns red, so when the gravity of Earth is no longer the dominating force, then that will be about the more ideal time to do some kind of mid-course correction. That dropped into the red, so go ahead and back off now. And there's a couple things you can do here. If I select Map MFD, reference the moon, and if I set up the target as, I don't know why that has that, but let's do this. If I set up the target as Brighton Beach, you'll notice as soon as I did that, I got new information over here. And just in case you missed it, let me do this. No base. Okay, watch over here. No base. Actually, I guess once you set that base up, then TransX inherits that information and doesn't drop it just because you select no base. But basically, this dashed yellow line that you see wasn't there until I selected Brighton Beach as the base, and I didn't have this off-plane distance and the PE distance to base. I didn't have that information until I selected Brighton Beach as the target. So now as I'm making my mid-course correction, I have more information that I can use. Instead of just bringing the minimum altitude down to what I want, say 35 kilometers, I can also start planning to have my approach to the moon put me in plane with my target base. So if I turn on maneuver mode, I can start going through the variables. And the first variable that I'm going to work with is the plane change. And I'm going to start with a fine setting just to see what happens. Okay, just with a little bit of fine, I've already adjusted my minimum altitude drastically. So let me see what's happening there with the off-plane distance. Okay, that's getting better. It's getting better, but it's also having a huge impact on my minimum altitude. So let me try to first of all reset that and work with one of the other variables. Let me use some outward, and because this will sometimes help the off-plane distance as well. That's helping. It's helping, and it's not requiring as much. So let me go to prograde, because you can see I'm now impacting the moon. That's no good. And basically, at this point, I'm just going to go back and forth between a couple of variables to see if I can get this off-plane distance down to 0, close to it, while still having a minimum altitude of 50 kilometers or thereabout. Okay, that's improving. See here, as I put in a little bit of negative prograde, it's basically raising my minimum altitude quite a bit, not doing a whole lot for my off-plane distance. But when I apply a little bit of outward velocity, that's improving my off-plane distance drastically, but it's also bringing my minimum altitude up a little bit. So I'm just going to play back and forth with these variables until I find that sort of sweet spot where each variable is giving me what I want exactly. It's getting pretty close. Yeah, this is good. Pretty good just like it is now. I've got a off-plane distance of only 2 kilometers, which is nothing. I mean, that's right there. Got a minimum altitude of 26 kilometers, which is enough. The highest peak on the moon is about 11 kilometers. So that's high enough that I wouldn't have to worry about crashing into anything, even if orbiter had terrain, which it doesn't. So that's fine. I can go ahead and burn this maneuver. One thing I do like to check when you're setting up these maneuvers, the amount of time that it takes to set everything up. This date was established the second that I turned maneuver mode on. So if I want to just be sure that the date, these few seconds that it's taken me to set this up, if I want to make sure that it's not going to have any impact on this, then I can reset the date, which will bring the date to right now. And you can see that it had very little to no impact. So I can go ahead and burn this maneuver right now, and knowing that this is all going to stay basically the same.
Rotation.
Or if I really wanted to, I could always go to the date and bump it up by 20 or 30 seconds. That way I've got a countdown, but it just doesn't matter. So I'm just lining up this green X. Went the wrong way with that.
Translation.
I'm just trying to get this down pretty close to 0. That's good enough. Click view a couple times to get over to maneuver. VAR until I get to maneuver mode, and we'll turn it off. And we can see that everything is still in good shape. Off-plane distance is virtually 0. I mean, that's 193 meters, and it's going to change continually as we get closer to the moon. So possibly here in a little while we might want to do one more mid-course correction, but most likely it won't be necessary. Now I'll reference the moon. And I'm 199,000 seconds away from the moon's periapsis. I'll fast forward time here. See, my projected minimum altitude is increasing, and this is slipping, so maybe I will go ahead and do one more mid-course here in a little while. And now I am within the moon's sphere of influence. It's SOI. I kind of always like to go prograde when I get here just to have a look. And let's take a look at our data. Minimum altitude 137. Off plane close to 50 kilometers. So I would say a second mid-course correction is definitely worthwhile. Turn maneuver mode on. Go through the variables. And we'll just do a little bit of inward would bring this down, and a little bit of plane change would probably improve this. Let me start with the plane change. Okay, it's going the wrong way. Let's go this way. That's helping. And before I take this all the way to 0, let me see what happens when I bring in some negative outward. That's also bringing that down a little bit. Let me go back to plane change. And that's pretty close to 0 there. Go back and do some more negative outward. And finally, last little bit of plane change. That's 15 kilometers. Or 15 meters, rather. That's 5 meters. That's 0 meters. And it'll probably never stay that accurate, but that's pretty cool that it's that close. 37 kilometers. A little on the high side for the moon. I'm being ridiculously meticulous at this point. This is absolutely unnecessary. And the date, first of all, reset it. I'll move it forward so I can get the countdown. Okay.
Rotation.
Fast forward time a little bit to get closer to 0, since I did go ahead and adjust the time. And the reason I did that this time and not the last time is because now that I'm closer to the moon, each second that goes by, the amount of change that I make to any direction, whether it be prograde, inward, outward, any plane change, every second that goes by, being this close to the moon, is a difference of enough meters that I do want the timing to be more accurate, whereas when I was way out from the moon, there just isn't enough. Those adjustments just can't make enough difference for 1 or 2 or even 10 or 20 seconds to make any difference. But this close to the moon, 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 seconds does make a difference. So that is why I went ahead and set the time on this burn.
Translation.
And burning. Actually, I can go ahead and use the main engines for a few seconds. and we'll say that's basically 0. Go back to View Maneuver, and turn off the maneuver mode. And we're still right there, 5 meters away from the base, 2 meters and counting down. And of course this will go into a negative number now. So as I get closer to the moon, this is going to continually skewed by a little bit, but it shouldn't be too much anymore. I mean, we're talking about 12 meters at this point, and obviously the Delta glider itself is more than 12 meters wide, so it's very accurate, or I mean very, very precise. If I really needed to, I probably do have time for one more mid-course correction when I get, say, to here or something, but I'm not going to bother. "2,000 seconds away from periapsis." Okay, just to be ridiculous. No, that's absolutely not worth it. 226 worth of delta just to bring that down to no way. That is definitely not worth it. Okay. Let's go ahead and fast forward to periapsis. And I know actually at periapsis, I can actually, while doing the deceleration burn, I can pitch and bring this down to 0 if I really wanted to do it that way. Just out of curiosity, I think I will. I'm just trying to figure out. I don't have a point of reference if I need to pitch up or down. Let me see if map MFD will reveal anything for me. Boy, it is so close, it's going to be hard to tell. I'm just going to have to guess at it. Basically try one direction, and if that doesn't help, then try the other direction. Okay, let me take a second here to pitch up a little bit and just do a test burn. Okay, that's going the wrong way. Okay, that's helping the off-plane distance. There we go. Okay, now I'll just do the retrograde burn per usual. Now that the time to periapsis is starting to count up, I'm going to wait a few seconds and start the burn over. Or not start it over, but start it up again. Because once periapsis starts counting up, then your actual periapsis will start declining. So time to periapsis at 25 seconds, I'll start up the burn again. Okay, the time to periapsis is still counting down. And time to periapsis is starting to count up again, but I'm not concerned if I lose a little bit on the periapsis at this point. Okay, that's high enough now. I'm going to wait. Checking my off-plane distance real quick. It's still, that's 500 meters. That's nothing.
Translation. Rotation.
But I could add a little bit of pitch just to bring it down. Oops. The wrong way. Or too much, rather.
Translation.
Okay, that is a very circular orbit. And with regards to our alignment with Brighton Beach, hard to imagine that it could really get any closer than that. Transx was very useful again. So now, obviously, I will rotate the moon in this direction, orbit the moon in this direction, which is a more normal, if you want to call it that, orbit. We're coming out of the west, going toward the east. So that means my inclination at the moon was, 50. Whereas if it's, 180 or something like that, then your orbital path is this direction. And that's kind of more, that's more common for that to be the case when you get to the moon, is to be orbiting retrograde. I believe that's what it's called, is when you're orbiting the moon effectively backwards. You're coming out of the east and going toward the west, and your inclination would be closer to 180. And again, either one of those is fine with me. 0, which is this way, or 180, which is this way. The only one I don't like is when it's 90, because then it's like I'm coming in over the poles, or if it's 270, because then I'm coming in over the poles the other direction. I don't like orbiting like that. This direction makes a lot, it just looks nicer and it's easier. So now if I wanted to, I could bring up the spaceport information, punch in for the transponder. What is it, 11630? And there's something on landing pad 1, so I would have to go with landing pad 2, 13230. And since I'm in the Delta glider, I'm not actually going to try to land. Do I want to? I don't know. I guess I could. The only thing I don't like about landing in the Delta glider, the regular, the generic one, is that it doesn't have any autopilots for the hover, really. It's got the hold, that's it, but it doesn't have a descent autopilot. So actually touching down on the landing pad using the generic Delta glider, it's just a lot of busy work. It's not that it's hard, it's just busy work, and I don't really care for busy work. So I've got a really good alignment with the beacon. It's off just a tad.
Rotation.
I have to think about this one for a second. Since I'm backwards, if I burn with the engines pointing that way, I never get this right. I always just have to guess. Do a little bit of a sideways burn just to try to wrong direction. Okay, now that's got that alignment. Basically, when the distance is 120 kilometers, that's usually when I start the deceleration burn. Maybe even 110. It really depends on how much fuel you're carrying, because that'll dictate how heavy your Delta glider is. But really, I think a distance of 120 is good, just in general. 120 kilometers. If you start to burn too much sooner than that, it's just going to take a really long time to get to Brighton Beach. And if you start it much later than that, you'll fly right over top of it. If you're a Rain Man, then you can look at these numbers as they're counting down, and you would be able to know, like, okay, right now I should take back some of the main engines a little bit, and then you'd be able to know exactly when you're gonna, the distance and everything. And I honestly, I'm just not that good at math. I could never figure all that out. Even with a calculator, I doubt I could figure it out. But it does look to me like the distance is slowing down substantially, so I'm going to back off the main engines a little bit and just let it close in for a while.
Translation. Rotation.
I'm going to go this direction a little bit. And reline that up.
Translation. Rotation.
Oops. Okay, now I'm in trouble.
Translation. Rotation.
I'm going to overshoot it. I always do that. Oh well. Maybe I won't. That looks like I got it. Okay. Open the retro. Take a peek outside. Brighton Beach is somewhere down below me. There it is. Switch over to the landing pad. Right now I'm in free fall. I think that's okay because I still got a ways to go. Eventually the vertical speed will become a problem and I'll have to engage some hover. In fact, I think I'll turn on a little bit of hover now. And I need to slow down my vertical speed a little bit more. Add a little more hover so it doesn't get too far out of control. Okay, it looks like the vertical speed's starting to slow down slowly.
Translation. Rotation. Translation. Rotation. Translation. Translation. Rotation.
This is why I'm not a fan of the landing with the Delta glider. It's just a lot of, like I said, a lot of busy work. Oops.
Translation. rotation, translation, rotation,
200.
translation,
Fifty, 40, 30.
Touchdown. Pretty much dead center. Off by just 1.12 meters. I've actually brought that. I've actually had this almost 0.00 before. But basically, as long as you're within 20 meters, I believe, then you're on the pad. So, that is how to go from the ISS directly to the moon, and that also added a lot of extra information that I hadn't planned on originally getting into, but I think some of the additional stuff ended up being useful.